In 1888, when copper was more valuable than silver and only slightly less precious than gold, William Andrews Clark spent $260,000 to build what locals called the ugliest house in Butte. The 34-room mansion towered over Montana Avenue like a Victorian nightmare, its turrets and gables painted in garish reds and greens that seemed designed to offend every rule of architectural taste. Clark didn't care. By the time he died in 1925, he had accumulated $200 million, roughly $4 billion today, making him one of the 5 richest men in America. But his castle, unlike the gilded monuments of Vanderbilt's and Astor's back east, wasn't built to impress society. It was built as a declaration of war. William Andrews Clark arrived in Montana Territory in 1863 with $2,000 in his pocket and something far more valuable, an accounting degree from Iowa Wesleyan University. While other prospectors tore at the earth with picks and pans, dreaming of quick fortunes, Clark studied ledgers. He was 24 years old, rail-thin, with piercing blue eyes that contemporaries described as calculating to the point of mechanical. He spoke 4 languages fluently, English, French, German, and Spanish, and could mentally calculate compound interest faster than most men could add simple columns. His first business wasn't mining. It was selling tobacco and sundries to miners at a 400% markup. Within 2 years, he'd accumulated $10,000. Within 5, he owned the camp's general store, its mail service, and held mortgages on half the claims in the Gulch. Clark's real genius revealed itself in 1872 when he correctly predicted that silver would collapse and copper would soar. While others panicked over the Coinage Act, Clark quietly bought copper claims everyone else was abandoning. He paid an average of $50 per claim. By 1876, those same claims were producing ore worth $30,000 monthly. He built his first smelter in 1878, undercutting every competitor by processing ore for 15% less than market rate while somehow maintaining higher purity yields. His method was simple. He worked his smelter workers 16-hour shifts at wages 20% below industry standard, replaced anyone who complained within 24 hours, and personally inspected the furnaces at 3 a.m. every morning to ensure no copper was being lost to slag. By 1885, Clark controlled 43 separate mining operations and employed 2,800 men. Those who called him ruthless were being generous, but William Clark faced a problem that money alone couldn't solve. In the 1880s, Montana Territory was controlled by a cartel of established families: the Daly interests, the Hauser banking dynasty, the Broadwater Railroad men. They had social legitimacy, they had political connections, they had invitations to the right parties in Helena and Washington, D.C. Clark had none of these things. He was viewed as nouveau riche, a glorified shopkeeper who'd gotten lucky. When he ran for territorial delegate to Congress in 1884, the Butte Miner newspaper, controlled by his rival Marcus Daly, wrote, "Mr. Clark has accumulated considerable wealth in Montana, but his manner of acquisition leaves much to be desired by those who value honor above lucre." Clark lost the election by 1/200 votes. The message was clear: Montana's establishment would never accept him through normal channels. William Clark's response was characteristically methodical. While Marcus Daly built a mansion in Hamilton, designed by a New York architect to win over territorial society, Clark studied what actually created lasting power. He examined the Medici in Florence, who'd built their dynasty not through noble birth, but through strategic patronage. He studied the Rothschilds, who'd secured influence across Europe by becoming indispensable to governments. He traveled to New York in 1886 and spent 6 weeks walking through the mansions of Fifth Avenue, taking notes on everything from doorknob placement to the thickness of carpets. But he also did something his competitors didn't. He rode the city's new elevated railways and watched where immigrants lived, where factories were built, where real people spent their days. When he returned to Butte in 1887, he knew exactly what he would build, and more importantly, why. Clark purchased the entire 300 block of West Granite Street in March 1887 for $18,000. The lot was considered undesirable, sitting directly downwind of the Anaconda smelter in a neighborhood of boarding houses and laundries. Polite society built on the west side, away from the industrial core. Clark did the opposite. He hired an architect named Henry Janeway Hardenberg, who just completed the Dakota Building in New York, and gave him explicit instructions. I want every person in Butte to see this house from their windows. I want it to dominate the skyline. I want it to be impossible to ignore. The two men spent 3 months arguing. Hardenberg wanted classical proportions and refined Victorian aesthetics. Clark wanted turrets, towers, gables, and a color scheme that one contemporary described as a sunset painted by a madman. Clark won every argument. He was paying $2,000 weekly for Hardenberg's time, approximately $58,000 weekly in modern dollars, and he intended to get exactly what he wanted. Construction began in April 1888, with a crew of 120 men working in 2 12-hour shifts. Clark imported red sandstone from Wisconsin, terracotta tiles from Ohio, and stained glass from studios in Munich that had previously worked only for Bavarian royalty. The foundation alone required 480 tons of Montana granite, cut from Clark's own quarry, 30 miles south of Butte. The castle rose 4 stories, crowned with turrets reaching 85 feet above street level. It contained 34 rooms, but Clark specified only 6 bedrooms. He wanted space for galleries, ballrooms, and something no other Montana mansion possessed: a dedicated art gallery with north-facing skylights and humidity controls. The exterior was painted in alternating bands of burgundy, forest green, and cream. Neighbors hated it. The Anaconda Standard called it an architectural abomination that makes a mockery of refined taste. Clark ordered additional turrets. The house had 10 bathrooms with running water, unprecedented in Butte, heated through a coal-fired boiler system that could maintain 72 degrees throughout winter, while outside temperatures reached 30 below zero. The main ballroom measured 45 feet by 60 feet, with 20-foot ceilings, decorated with frescoes depicting scenes from Roman history that Clark himself had sketched during a trip to Pompeii. The dining room could seat 40 guests at a table carved from a single mahogany tree imported from Honduras at a cost of $3,000. But the heart of the house was the art gallery. Clark had been quietly purchasing paintings since the early 1880s. Initially as investments, then with growing passion. He owned works by Rembrandt, Titian, and Gainsborough, along with contemporary artists like William Adolphe Bouguereau and Jean-Léon Gérôme. His collection was valued at $600,000 in 1890, approximately $19 million today. He displayed these masterpieces in a gallery that rivaled anything in Denver or San Francisco, yet charged nothing for admission. Every Thursday afternoon from 2 to 5 p.m., Clark opened his gallery to the public. Miners, shopkeepers, children, anyone could walk in and view European masterpieces. For 3 years, the castle served its purpose. Clark hosted political dinners where he displayed not wealth alone, but culture, sophistication, and intellectual depth. He invited Mark Twain to stay for a week in 1891. He hosted lectures by professors from Yale and Columbia. He funded the city's first free library and built a music hall that seated 800. He was methodically demonstrating that he possessed everything Montana's establishment claimed he lacked. In 1893, he ran again for the U.S. Senate. States now elected senators by legislative vote and lost by just 3 votes. His opponents had bribed key legislators. Clark responded by buying a newspaper, the Butte Miner's rival publication, and spending $140,000 to elect a legislature favorable to his interests. When he ran again in 1899, he won. It took a Senate investigation to prove he'd spent $272,000 in direct bribes, approximately $9.5 million today. Clark was forced to resign in 1900, but he'd proven his point. Everything was for sale, including democracy. The scandal that destroyed Clark's Senate career paradoxically cemented his legend. He was censured, but never prosecuted. His fortune continued growing. Copper demand exploded as electricity transformed American cities. By 1905, Clark's annual income exceeded $7 million. He owned mines in Montana, Arizona, and Nevada. He controlled railroads, banks, timber operations, and utilities. His wealth generated wealth with mechanical efficiency. He remarried in 1901 at age 62 to Anna LaChapelle, his ward, who was 23. They had 2 children. Clark spent increasingly less time in Butte, preferring homes in New York, Paris, and Los Angeles. The Butte mansion became a showpiece he occupied perhaps 6 weeks annually. A permanent staff of 12 maintained the property in his absence, dusting paintings, polishing silver, heating empty rooms. The cost of maintenance exceeded $30,000 yearly, the equivalent of maintaining a small museum. Clark died in New York City on March 2, 1925, at age 86. His fortune had swelled to $200 million, despite decades of spectacular spending. His will divided assets among his children and specified that his art collection should be donated to the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. The Butte mansion went to his son, William Andrews Clark, Jr., who'd moved to Los Angeles years earlier to manage his own banking empire. The younger Clark visited Butte once for the funeral, surveyed the mansion, and made a practical calculation. Annual maintenance exceeded $40,000. Property taxes were $8,000 yearly and rising. The house occupied a valuable downtown block in a city whose population had peaked in 1920 at 60,000 and was now declining as copper prices fell. The building itself was, objectively, hideous. Selling it was impossible. Who would buy a 34-room mansion in declining industrial town? The obvious solution was demolition. In this, Clark's castle joined an accelerating American trend. Between 1925 and 1935, 43 major Gilded Age mansions were demolished in New York alone. The William Kissam Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, built in 1879 for $3 million, was torn down in 1926, just 47 years after completion, to make way for a commercial building. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, which occupied an entire block at 5th and 57th and had cost $6 million to build, survived only 35 years before demolition in 1926. The Astor Mansion, the Gould Mansion, the Belmont Mansion, all gone by 1930. The problem wasn't just changing taste. The federal income tax introduced in 1913 and the estate tax introduced in 1916 made maintaining huge private residences economically irrational. A mansion requiring 30 servants faced annual payroll costs of $50,000 to $75,000 while providing no income. Property taxes on Fifth Avenue parcels soared as commercial development drove land values higher. The land became worth more than the buildings upon it. But something unexpected happened in Butte. Charles William Clark, William Jr.'s brother and executor of the estate, visited the mansion in August 1925 for a final assessment. He was 52 years old, managed the family's Montana mining interests, and had inherited his father's calculating mind. Walking through the gallery, he found 78 paintings that hadn't been included in the Corcoran donation. His father had specified only the main collection. These were secondary works, studies, and pieces acquired after the will was written. Charles valued them at $180,000. He also discovered something else. The guest register from 1924 showed 2,400 public visitors had toured the gallery during the house's 6 weeks of occupancy. Even when William Sr. was absent, the Thursday public hours continued. Local schools brought students. The mining company ran special viewing days for workers' families. The castle had become almost accidentally a public institution. Charles Clark made an unusual proposal to his siblings in October 1925. Rather than demolish the mansion immediately, they should operate it as a museum for 3 years while liquidating their father's other Montana properties. The 78 remaining paintings could anchor a permanent collection. They could charge modest admission, 50 cents for adults, nothing for children, to offset maintenance while establishing the house as a cultural asset. If it generated sufficient revenue, they could donate it to the city or a preservation trust. If not, they'd demolish in 1928 with clear consciences, having given Montana one last chance to appreciate what William Clark built. The siblings agreed. On April 15, 1926, the mansion officially became the Clark Memorial Museum. Admission was 50 cents. Hours were Wednesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Initial projections estimated 5,000 annual visitors. The first year brought 11,300 visitors and receipts of $5,100. This didn't cover the $40,000 maintenance cost, but it revealed something significant. People were driving from Helena, from Missoula, from as far as Spokane, to see the Copper Baron's castle. They came partly for the paintings, but mostly for the house itself. The mansion represented something Montana's industrial workers understood viscerally. The staggering inequality of Gilded Age capitalism made tangible. William Clark's bathroom fixtures cost more than most miners earned in 5 years. His dining table cost what a smelter worker made in 8 years. Touring the mansion wasn't about aspiration, it was about bearing witness. Charles Clark, recognizing this, made a crucial decision. He hired 2 former miners as guides who gave tours explaining not just the art and architecture, but the labor that paid for it. One guide, Patrick McCarthy, had worked in Clark's mines for 22 years. His standard speech began, "Mr. Clark paid me $350 per day. The frescoes you're looking at cost $8,000. That's 2,286 days of my labor, or about 6 years and 3 months, to paint clouds on a ceiling." The approach was revolutionary. Instead of sanitizing Clark's legacy, the museum confronted it directly. Visitors learned that the mahogany table represented 857 days of miner wages. The Rembrandt in the gallery cost the equivalent of 34 miners working full-time for a year. This honesty generated something unexpected: credibility. The museum wasn't celebrating Clark, it was documenting him. Schools throughout Montana began including the museum in curriculum. College professors brought history classes. Labor unions used it for educational tours. By 1928, annual attendance reached 18,000. Revenue was $8,300, still nowhere near covering costs, but Charles Clark renewed the experiment for another 3 years. His reasoning was simple. The Depression was beginning. Demolition costs would run $25,000 to $30,000. The mansion now employed 8 people full-time in a city where unemployment was reaching 30%. Keeping it open was, perversely, cheaper than closing it. The Depression validated the museum model. By 1933, attendance reached 26,000 annually despite, or because of, economic collapse. Admission dropped to 25 cents to accommodate reduced incomes, but volume increased. The museum represented something psychologically valuable during the Depression, evidence that even the mightiest fortunes were impermanent. William Clark had been richer than entire states. His mansion still stood, but as a public museum, not a private palace. There was dark comfort in that. Charles Clark died in 1933, but his widow Catherine continued the museum operation. She understood intuitively that the mansion had become more valuable as symbol than as real estate. The land might be worth $50,000, but the cultural significance was incalculable. In 1939, she established the Clark Foundation, donating the mansion and a $200,000 endowment to create Montana's first permanent house museum. The timing was deliberate. The IRS had just introduced charitable deduction rules that made such donations financially advantageous while avoiding estate taxes. The foundation struggled financially for 2 decades. Maintenance costs steadily increased, while admission revenue remained flat. By 1958, the building needed $85,000 in structural repairs. The foundation was settling, the roof leaked, the heating system was obsolete. The foundation board debated selling. Then Catherine Holter, a board member who'd grown up in Butte during William Clark's lifetime, made an observation that changed everything. She noted that 70% of museum visitors were from out of state. They weren't coming for Montana history, they were coming for Gilded Age history. The mansion wasn't a regional attraction, it was a national example of something increasingly rare. Between 1920 and 1960, roughly 85% of America's great Gilded Age mansions had been demolished. What remained were mostly East Coast properties that had become museums or universities. Clark's Castle was the West's only comparable survivor, and it told a story the others couldn't. The story of extractive capitalism on the frontier. Robert Giddings, hired as director in 1961 at age 43, understood this positioning. He'd previously worked at Colonial Williamsburg and knew how to build historical narratives that served contemporary purposes. His philosophy was direct. Preservation isn't about prettifying the past. It's about using intact examples to understand how systems of power actually functioned. Under Giddings, the museum expanded exhibits to include mining equipment, labor union records, and photographs of the workers who built Clark's fortune. The mansion became a case study. Visitors could see the $8,000 frescoes, then walk downstairs to see photographs of the miners who earned $350 daily. The juxtaposition was the point. Attendance grew from 28,000 in 1961 to 44,000 in 1965. More importantly, the museum attracted foundation support from organizations interested in labor history and industrial heritage. A Ford Foundation grant in 1966 provided $200,000 for building restoration and archive development. The 1970s brought the museum into financial stability through an unexpected source: tourism infrastructure. Butte's population had declined to 37,000, but Interstate 90 now ran near the city, and tourists driving between Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks needed attractions. The State Tourism Board began marketing Montana's Copper King Mansions as a destination. The Clark Museum was joined by the Daley Mansion in Hamilton and the Copper King Mansion in Butte, formerly owned by Clark's rival. Together, they formed a circuit that kept tourists in Montana an extra day. The economic impact was measurable. By 1978, the Clark Museum attracted 62,000 annual visitors, who collectively spent an estimated $1.8 million in Butte on hotels, restaurants, and gas. The museum had become economically useful to the city in ways William Clark himself would have appreciated. It generated revenue without extracting ore. Under director Patricia Schaefer, who took over in 1985, the museum adopted aggressive diversification. Schaefer, 51 years old with a PhD in public history from Arizona State, believed historic houses needed multiple revenue streams to survive long-term. She introduced museum memberships, generating $40,000 annually by 1990. She established a museum store selling books, reproductions, and local crafts, adding $65,000 yearly. She rented the ballroom for weddings and corporate events, bringing $85,000 annually while requiring minimal wear on historic spaces. Events were strictly catered, no dancing on original floors, capacity limited to 60 people. Most controversially, she partnered with Montana State University to offer semester-long internships where students restored specific rooms under professional supervision. This provided free skilled labor while training the next generation of preservationists. Critics called it exploitation. Schaefer called it teaching by doing, exactly how apprenticeships worked when this house was built. By 2000, the museum operated with an annual budget of $680,000, 70% self-generated through admissions, events, and donations. The foundation endowment had grown to $3.2 million through careful management and major gifts from descendants of Montana mining families. The mansion attracted 71,000 annual visitors and employed 14 full-time staff, plus 30 seasonal workers. The collection had expanded to include 380 paintings, 2,400 artifacts, and 18,000 archival documents related to Montana's copper mining era. The museum had become what Charles Clark proposed in 1925, a sustainable institution that honored complicated history without celebrating it. Purists occasionally objected. Was it appropriate to rent Gilded Age ballrooms for corporate Christmas parties? Schaefer's response was pragmatic. Would you prefer we lock the doors and let the roof collapse? A historic house that generates revenue is a historic house that survives. Those are your options. The Clark Foundation today operates as a private non-profit, governed by a 12-member board with no family members. The last Clark descendant retired from the board in 1992. This structure provides independence while maintaining stability. Annual attendance has plateaued around 68,000 to 72,000 visitors, generating roughly $500,000 in admission and store revenue. Events and rentals add $180,000. Donations and grants contribute $200,000. The total budget exceeds $900,000, covering staff, utilities, maintenance, and ongoing restoration. The mansion underwent major structural stabilization in 2012, costing $4 million, funded through a combination of foundation reserves, state historic preservation grants, and a capital campaign that raised $680,000 in 18 months. This financial model, diverse revenue, prudent reserves, strategic fundraising, has proven replicable. The National Trust for Historic Preservation cites the Clark Museum as a model for sustainable house museum operations. The mansion means different things to different constituencies. For tourists, it's a well-preserved example of Gilded Age excess, comparable to anything in Newport or the Berkshires, but located improbably in Montana. For Butte residents, it's complicated, a symbol of the inequality that built their city and the history that defines it. For labor historians, it's invaluable documentation of how extractive capitalism functioned at ground level. For preservationists, it's proof that controversial history can be preserved if approached with intellectual honesty rather than celebration. The museum doesn't ask visitors to admire William Clark. It asks them to understand him, his brilliance, his ruthlessness, his cultural ambitions, and his disregard for human cost. This unflinching approach has made the museum more relevant, not less, in an era increasingly focused on reckoning with complicated historical figures. Consider the alternatives. The Daley Mansion in Hamilton, built by Clark's rival Marcus Daley, was donated to the state in 1987 and operates as a state park. Annual attendance is 12,000, one-sixth of the Clark Museum's numbers. The state struggles to fund adequate maintenance. The original Anaconda Mansion, owned by the copper company itself, was demolished in 1954. The Berkeley Pit, which replaced many of Butte's mines, is now a toxic lake of acid mine drainage that itself has become a tourist attraction. Of the three copper barons who controlled Montana in the 1890s, Clark, Daley, and F. Augustus Heinze, only Clark's primary residence survives intact. The crucial difference wasn't the building's architecture or even its collection. The difference was Charles Clark's decision in 1925 to experiment with public access rather than immediate demolition, followed by Catherine Clark's decision in 1939 to establish a foundation structure that could outlive family involvement. These two decisions, make it public, make it independent, created institutional survival. Today, visitors entering the Clark Castle see the same burgundy and green exterior that horrified neighbors in 1888. The turrets still dominate Butte's skyline. The gallery still contains European masterpieces hung exactly as William Clark specified. But the rooms now include context he never intended: photographs of miners, union records, equipment catalogs, payroll documents. The house has become its own museum, documenting not just one man's taste, but an entire economic system. Children on school tours learn that the marble fireplace cost as much as building 20 workers' houses. College students studying economics see physical evidence of wealth inequality that makes statistics tangible. The mansion hasn't survived by hiding its dark history. It's survived by illuminating it. The lesson extends beyond Montana. Historic preservation isn't about freezing the past in amber. It's about creating sustainable institutions that can evolve while maintaining integrity. The Clark Museum succeeds because it solved the fundamental problem that killed most Gilded Age mansions. It found ways to generate value, economic, educational, cultural, that justify the extraordinary cost of maintaining a 34-room house built to glorify one man's ego. Where the Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue palaces became commercially developed lots because they provided no ongoing utility, the Clark Castle provides utility through education, tourism, and honest historical reckoning. The house William Clark built to prove his worth has survived by becoming valuable for entirely different reasons than he imagined. That transformation, from private monument to public resource, from celebration to examination, from closed palace to open classroom, is what preservation actually looks like when done right. The castle still stands not despite its dark history, but because that history, honestly told, remains worth preserving.